Hey guys, how's it going? For the second part of this, I wanted to start off with everything I talked about last time, just a quick little recap, right? We create the SageMaker endpoint, we're at the end of the file, and now what do? How do we take everything down? So I actually ran the make down just so that you could see how easy it is to take it down. I ran make down, and this is what I get at the end. I get resources, 39 are destroyed, fantastic. Sometimes I stood up more, which is why in the README, you see 42. But for whatever the case is, it's 39 this time. I had a couple of less buckets, more ECR, the whole fun stuff behind Terraform. But either way, all torn down. We're great. Let's start from scratch. So now that we're starting over, you can see that I say in the Airflow deployment, steps 1 through 4. We've got to run them. Let's run them again, right? We need to re-stand up our Terraform resources in order to be able to use the Airflow and connect the two together. So the cool part is, right, from the first video, we've already got this stood up, right? And I just ran the make env check just so that we would be able to see like that the environment variables are set. So I don't need to go there, but I do need to go back to Terraform and I need to be able to run these guys, right? So I need to run a make bootstrap. I'm gonna let that run for a second. There we go. I'm gonna do a make plan just to make sure everything looks, again, according to plan. We'll run that. It's gonna say, hey, this is what we expect. Do you expect to have 43 of these guys? Yes, I do, right? And then I'm gonna do a make apply, and I'm gonna let it stand all those resources up. Cool, so now you can see the resources are all stood up again. I have new ARNs from the last video, right? This is the beauty of it. Take it down, stand it up, tear it down, stand it up. You got the subnets, you got the whole 9 yards, right? Eventually, we're going to need to glue these to Airflow. So how do we do that? The one thing that I want to show you slightly different than the last video is rather than running this make build push this time, I'm going to show you how we are automating this with the OpenID Connect with GitHub and AWS to make this, again, automatic. So for example, I have these commit changes. I wrote AWS configure for Airflow is the commit, right? So I have a couple readmes. Let me add this change in here too. And I've got a couple items that I want to push to the repo. So when I do a commit and then I do a sync, we're going to go check out what's actually happening inside of GitHub. But you can see that once I ran that commit and I synced it to the main branch, we now have inside of GitHub Actions, this action is going off. So let's go inside of it and actually check out what's happening. So we can see that it's building. What is it building, right? You're more than welcome to read the ci.yaml specifically inside the repo, but high level, this is what's happening. Is it's running these actions behind the scenes, and it always wants me to go to the bottom of the logs in the beginning. It's just doing a job setup. It's making sure that I'm configuring the OIDC to AWS. High level, if you're not familiar with OIDC, it's really just about AWS generating kind of temporary credentials to GitHub, so that way it's able to run and push. So essentially what I'm doing is logging into the ECR, and then I'm building and pushing those Docker images automatically. And then those credentials, become obfuscated in the matter of, I think it's like 15 minutes or something like that. And so what that allows is you don't have to have like long-standing credentials sitting from AWS inside of GitHub, right, to get compromised or anything like that. It's just like good security protocol. So this build and push is taking a second per usual, right? We're building all the Docker files from the service, the batch, the features, and the training module. And we're uploading those inside of AWS just like we did last time, right? So we ran manually make, build, push last time. What we're doing this time is it's running it automatically for us, right? So if you come down here, you can see that it's doing all the fun stuff that you would expect in Docker, right? It's running all the pip installs and the updates to the README or to the requirements.txt and all that stuff. And it's actually getting to the pushing of the 4 images that we have. It keeps trying to scroll down on me. I don't want it to, right? So we have the training, the inference, the features, and the batch, and all those are going to be pushed up to AWS automatically. So we actually don't need to run a make, build, push. And the beauty of this is anytime your data science team or you or whatever your cadence is on your organization, these will automatically get updated, right? You make a better model, you just simply commit to GitHub. This will stand it up and you're good to go. Cool. It ran to completion. We can see that all the check marks went through properly. We're happy and we're good to move on from there. So now we've ran steps 1 through 4, we've reprovisioned, we basically did the entire first video all the way to right now, right? It's just a matter of minutes once you get the hang of it. Now, a couple things, we're gonna run the local airflow, right? So first it's gonna be Docker locally, so that way we could debug and all that fun stuff before we move to what I would consider production, like MWAA, which is the managed workflow for Apache Airflow by AWS. And that has its own headaches, right, in production, but this gets us to as close to production right before we're truly in production. So now what we'd run is an AWS configure. I've actually created this. The high level AWS configure is just going to make this profile, right? So I have a Kevin sandbox, for example. And so the main concept that when you run configure is that you end up with this. You can also do this manually. You don't have to run the configure step. You're not comfortable with it, right? So you can CD to this local AWS directory that you have on your home computer, right? So this brings me down to my root.aws folder. And then I have a credentials file. And in my credentials, I have something like this. Everybody always has a default for AWS. And then I have an IAM profile, right? So again, this is my Kevin Sandbox profile, and I have my own access key and secret key ID. That's really what you need. You don't have to run configure. You can manually come do it, nano, create the credentials, cat it, whatever, type of terminal command you want to run to make it happen. And then you want to make sure that your nano config has the same thing, right? So when you nano, right, inside of the AWS folder, you have both credentials and you have config. So then my config as well, right, I have a default of US West 2 as an output, and then I have, again, my profile, and then I have my region and my output. Those are just the setup steps that you need. Why do you do that, right? We have a .env file. It makes it a little bit cleaner in the AWS or inside of Airflow in order to get these environment variables up there naturally, because that's where Airflow naturally looks. Is in it will look for a default profile, but if not, it goes, hey, I'm gonna go look for a .aws file. And I'll show you just quickly what that's looking like inside of the compose, just so that way it doesn't seem like there's a little too much magic is what I'm gearing towards, right? I want like a little bit of magic, but not too much. And the video series where we could be here for, an infinite amount of times. You can see that I have this AWS shared credentials file and a config file. So what I'm doing is I'm just saying like, hey, I want you to put in the volumes, right? I take my local AWS folder, and this is where you're going to put it inside of Airflow. And then Airflow is going to go, okay, cool. Like these are my AWS credentials file and the config file. So it's going to know where to look even when it doesn't find this quote unquote default profile, right? Because we supplied the IAM. So that is what's going to connect our AWS credentials to our Airflow credentials. So that way Airflow is able to read things from GitHub, not from GitHub, from AWS, and be able to actually run our DAGs. But now let's actually create Airflow, right? So the beauty of Airflow is that the Docker Compose takes, almost all the hard work out of it, right? This Docker Compose was stand up on their documentation, right? So even if you ask chat, they'll probably reference their documentation, but this documentation sits inside of like the actual Airflow docs. And this is just like a stand up build up, right? So like I didn't go through and create each one of these images or each one of these pieces of the compose file. I did a lot of the cookie cutter. I added a couple of my regions and profiles. I added a little bit to the volumes and some of the, the DAGs and the Airflow protection, but I didn't do too much, right? So luckily they have most of this up, right? They have the Postgres and the Redis services and the API services. It's all stood up for you. And they naturally expose it on port 8080, right? So they do the heavy lifting, which is great. And so when I come back to the README, I've again, just made it as simple as possible. I just go to Airflow, and then you can just run the Docker Compose up-D, and we'll deploy it together and get it up and running. So when I run that, you can see the containers start getting read. This is where my AWS credentials in that AWS folder locally is being uploaded into Airflow so that it can find those credentials moving forward. I'll give it a second to let this run. It stood up pretty fast, only a couple seconds later. And so then you can run, I just wrote this little command right here. It's just to double check that you have everything set up, right? So you have your AWS profiles, Kevin Sandbox, and then my region. And you can see it's now referencing the Airflow credentials and the config file so that it's now properly stood up. So now let's move on to the next one. We'll just clear it out. We've already run the make build push. You could run it again if you've made any changes in here. Let's run a make prep data. Why? Because we didn't put any data, again, since we tore down and stood back up those S3 buckets. We have some data in there, right? So we'll just make that guy. Great piece of advice. You got to be in the root folder to run the make commands. So make prep data, that's going to go shoot it up to the AWS bucket. And bang, we uploaded 10,000 to that bucket, just like we showed last time. And then we're going to do run make AF vars clear. I have this just so if you're doing this multiple times, your AF vars, these are the environment variables that are being set, right? And this is how Terraform is actually sending it to Airflow. So any of the Airflow specific environment variables that are needed from Terraform, right? So from your Terraform outputs page, again, I'll show a little bit, not too much of the magic. If we go into infra and we go into Terraform and then we go to outputs, right? These are the outputs we need. So for example, we're going to need the features task definition ARN, right? That's coming from my ECS module, which calls the Docker file, which eventually pushes up into the features, pushes the features image up into ECR. So eventually we're going to need that in order to build the features, and Airflow needs to know where that is. So it needs to have the ARN, just, small things. And that's really what's happening with all these, right? Here's the SageMaker role. And if we come into the DAG that will actually run, I don't want to get too deep in the DAG. You can see the DAG calls things like the features ARN, right? So it's going to basically go, hey, AWS, what do you have for me? And it's going to go, yep, I have this ARN. This is where the module sits. This is where the images sit. This is what you're going to use to actually run the DAG. And the DAG high level is almost the exact same make steps that we ran last time. We'll go through it just a touch, right? We have build features, right? So just build the features that we have. We're going to run a training. This looks exactly like we have make SM train. Now we're just doing it inside of Airflow. And then we're going to grab the model, and then we're going to get the model data, right? So all the fun stuff that's happening behind the scenes inside of SageMaker. And then we're going to register and pick the model. This will do an auto approve delegation. So sometimes you need human in the loop. Like I know at Coinbase when I was there, right, we would always do manual reviews, but you could do auto approvals if you're like the AUCs are definitively better, right? So you don't want to sometimes, and I would say almost all companies I know, they always have some human in the loop, right? There's me to go, okay, the AUCs do check out, the statistical, it's statistically relevant. Like there's not a crazy imbalance in the data where I veto this model moving forward, right? So then I click OK, and SageMaker goes and auto provisions that to the endpoint. So we do that, and then we create the model, right? Again, same steps we've been running in the make file, and then we create the config, and then we deploy that endpoint, right, where we're actually going, what we ran the smoke test in the first video, and then we're just going to check the health. And here's kind of all of it right here. It's just, I have just have the explanation, and you'll notice this in all the files. Maybe I should have mentioned this earlier. I have this word explanation. I just write a quick little tidbit, right? So if you're new to any of these pieces of the puzzle, or you're like myself and you're just remembering pieces of Terraform or Airflow to jog your brain, it just gives you a quick little explanation. Like we're defining the task dependencies for auto promotion of the workflow, right? So we build the features, we train it, we get the model, we register the model, we create the model, we config, we deploy, we health. Cool. Let's clear the variables just in case, right? I probably have some hanging around, right? But I actually just stood up these, this Airflow, so I actually don't think that's the case. But this will just delete any old lagging ones that are hanging around, so you don't have to go sit there and hunt them down in the GUI or anything like that. And it'll just wipe you to a clean slate, and it doesn't cause you any harm if you run this command anyways. It'll just say deleted for those. Now let's actually run these. So this is going to set the Airflow variables from the Terraform generated values, right? So this make AF vars from TF does exactly that, right? So connect Airflow with the output variables that we had just discussed, like the features ARN, and it's going to start setting these guys. So you can see all these guys have been set up, like the variable, the ECS cluster, and the subnets, and the inference images, and the training images, right? They've all been set. Feel free to ignore this empty cryptography. Again, remember, you're just local on your computer, right? You're going to be on your local host, so this is not like a big thing. You can always set this key when you go to prod. It's not that big of a deal. So you can see that I've actually already run this, but it's the make AFR show. That just, again, one more quick step. Like, let's make sure that everything we've anticipated and expected is set up correctly. Airflow sees it, AWS sees it, Terraform has the outputs. We're happy. Now let's actually go run this quick render step. What is a render step? It just shows you what, it's kind of reminds me of like Terraform plan. It's like what Airflow will run. So here's just an example that you can check out. And again, made this make command as simple as possible. We can just talk about it real quick. there's the AF render, right? So this is the command itself. You can come inside of the make file and look up render. And this is what it's running behind the scenes, right? It's just basically calling into the container of Airflow. It's running the task, it's gonna render it, and then it just asks for the DAG, the task, and the date timestamp that you wanna put in. So for me, I'm just gonna say, hey, can you render me the train? You can feel free to change this. We have the build features task too. Anything that you want, click it, run it. It will just show you what it anticipates running. So you can see here's all the things, here's like the subnets, here's the task definitions, all the stuff that will, and you can run it for train too, right? So let's say we want to run it for train. And this is just going to call into the SM train capability. This is the render, like this is what's going to happen. It's going to run this training job, and you know, here's the features that it's going to pull from, and here's the output path, and here's the type of models, M5, all this fun stuff, right? So that's just quickly like a stage. Then you can run make AF test inside of this guy, right? So I could run this guy and just do build features as the first one of my DAG. Let's go look at that. It actually might help explain like what's happening behind the scenes. So I know that I was kind of moving a little quick through the make file there, but let's just take a second and be like, hey, we have Airflow up. Remember, you can get to Airflow inside of the terminal, but sometimes it is nice to have a GUI, and that's why it's here, and that's why it's very pretty. So you can see inside of Airflow, if I go to home, this is what you'll end up seeing. And I can go to DAGs, and there's just going to be like a bazillion DAGs because they have examples. You could tell it, hey, don't upload the example DAGs inside of the compose. But I like running them. I like checking them out. I like seeing what, you know, different people do inside of their examples. But the one we really care about is this Condor ML pipeline, right? That's the one that we stood up. That's the one that's inside of our repo. And you can see, you know, some of these I've broken, some of them have run successfully, some of them get halfway through. That's the beauty of Airflow, right? So this is, again, high level, just the GUI version of what we're doing in the terminal. And I don't want to get too deep, right? There's like a bazillion Airflow pieces of documentation. So that's not really the goal here. It's how do we actually run something? So when I go back to VS Code and I run a test, it's basically testing this build features task right here. You can see that I ran the build features task, and it's just going to test it behind the scenes, right? So it's a test is what I would, it's just like it sounds, right? I'm not triggering the entire pipeline. I'm just running this individual one, right? So you can see it's done things like it's the ECS task has started. So when we come into the pipeline, right, and we go to the very first task in the DAG, right, the ECS run task operator is being called. It's called by, again, what we did, build features right here. And then it's calling the ECS cluster ARN. The launch type is Fargate for right now. You can provision your own EC2s and add your own load balancers and the whole 9 yards. It's a little bit cheaper if you really get into it. So if you have the engineering team to do it, it makes sense, especially if you're running this all the time. But if you're not running this all the time, you know, Fargate does just fine, especially if you're doing something like right now, you're building it, you're tearing it down, you're just basically doing it for a learning type purpose. And then it sets the subnets and the security groups and all that fun stuff. So you can see that the task is in a success state, right? So that's great. It ran. We know that it's working. So now what's the next step? Let's actually trigger something. One thing I actually really like to do is I like to go in this make AF shell. It's not much different than the test you just saw right there. But if I run make AF shell, this is actually, I'm now inside of the Airflow container that's running everything, right? I can see the config, the DAGs, the logs, the plugins, all that fun stuff. I like to actually run the file raw. I actually learned this trick not too long ago, and it will help you debug your pipeline. I think it's better than having to go to the GUI, right? So I go to the GUI and then I have to like go to the code, and then like there's not really like an IDE here to read anything. You can see that I have this if name equals main. This is what's uploaded. That's what will allow me to actually run the dag.test when I go to VS Code. And then I actually get all the logs just in one spot, right? I don't have to like click around at random tasks and go like, oh, did this work? Did this work? I just get the failure, which is what I would say most of us coding professionals are used to. So let's just look at it there. So I'm gonna run this test right here rather than the Condor pipeline, just because it does take a while. But if I just run Python, I have to Python dags test, and I run it. You see that it starts kicking out the test of this dag, and it's very annoying, right? It's like extremely verbose, but sometimes the verbosity is great, right? So it will like tell you like all the context variables that got uploaded. I actually really like doing it. So then you can see the DAG test, and then you can see like if it was successful. Again, it is very verbose, but sometimes you'd rather have too much verbosity than just like guessing around the GUI exactly where to go. So we can see that that one ran, and you can run and trigger the whole DAG from this guy, right? So you can do that. This really what this command is doing. These are essentially doing the exact same thing, but let's run the make command that makes it pretty. So I have to exit out because remember we're inside of the Airflow container. And so now I'm at the root directory of our project again, and I'm gonna run the make AF trigger of the Condor pipeline, and then we'll go inside the GUI. So click this, it's triggering this pipeline. Let's go see what that looks like inside the GUI. We're inside the GUI, what is happening? Let's go to Condor ML pipeline, and you can see that this guy just kicked off, now running. So what it's gonna do is it's gonna run chronologically. I actually really like this piece of the GUI setup. It like lets me see what tasks and when something failed. So first off, it's running build features, right? So we could come inside of build features, and we could come inside of the logs. Again, I prefer the logs locally on VS Code, but whatever, it doesn't matter. And so it's just gonna run this guy. It's gonna run the same task we just did with the render a couple minutes ago and the test. And it's gonna slowly process. I'm not gonna sit here the whole time while it's processing, because if you remember all the make commands, some of them took some time. But you can see that this first task went off, and now it's going to the second task automatically, right? So we can click back on this guy. We can see that it takes sometimes half a second to update. Yep, so build features successful. Now it's going to the training pipeline. So what's happening inside the training pipeline? Click on it. Oh, it's calling the AWS training image, right? It's calling the Condor training latest image that's inside of AWS, and it's running it, right? And it's gonna run the training job name here. That's happening automatically inside of SageMaker. So we're gonna let these DAGs run and process sequentially, and I'll come back at the end, and then we'll smoke test this deployment of the endpoint, right? It's gonna be the same thing as the make file. It's gonna smoke it, deploy it, and we'll see the prediction. As we did it, right? Look at all that green over here. That whole, oh God, it's just beautiful. Just absolutely beautiful, right? And then you can see like, again, the CloudWatch logs that we had in the last video inside of AWS, right? These are the same things, right? We have an AUCs, this is all happening inside of the training pipeline, right? It completes. You can come through each one of these guys, right? The get model, the create registry, the whole 9 yards. You can come to the deployment. I always like to click on this guy specifically, and then I like to head down to which individual task I like when I'm coming through here. But then we can see that we have the deployment. So we come all down, it'll say like, hey, you know, I've deployed, here's your endpoint, all the fun stuff, right? So now let's actually go smoke test this endpoint. Now we're back inside here, right? Our DAG ran, and then look, I ran make SM smoke test the endpoint, right? So now it worked, right? So we just did an entire production model, right? And the cool part is about Airflow, this can just auto provision, right? So this will run on some cadence. You can run it some nightly bash job. You can run it however you'd like to run it. You don't have to run any specific cadence, right? You could set up triggers inside of AWS, like when new files get dropped in, right? All the fun stuff. There's a billion things to do. If you come back into the GUI, you can set a timer, for example. In the GUI, right, we can see that the last run just completed, all is happy and hunky-dory. And then the next run, though, is at 1600, right? So this will automatically run. Again, all of our resources are set up. This is still going to run locally, and you still want a production version of Airflow, but this is pretty darn close to the production version. I'll see if I get the MWAA stood up easily. I'm actually quite nervous to get it provisioned inside of this project. Why? Because I'm worried that someone else will stand it up, and they'll have their Terraform resources up and not realize how expensive it is. MWAA can be quite expensive, especially if you don't deploy it like on your own infra, right? So like you're not managing the Airflow infra, they're doing it for you. It makes it very nice. You can make it a lot cheaper if you do it, but it has its own quirks, nicks and crannies. if you're just standing it up for like a day, that's fine, but the bill can get expensive, right? It can get 500, 1,000, and if you're a big company, obviously that doesn't matter, right? If you're Coinbase or you're whoever, you can spend that money because you have the revenue, right? But if you're an individual learning this, standing this up at a very small startup, you might be nervous. So I'll debate that. I'll show you it either way, like what you would do and how the endpoint would look. But there's some great MWA videos on YouTube as it is. So, anyways, guys, I hope that this was insightful. I hope you feel cool and confident. You're in the matrix. You're able to deploy machine learning endpoints for anybody to use, your company to use, yourself to use, right? This is a Condor strategy. We do very similar things like this at the Infinity Fund. Often we don't need this level of infrastructure, right? This is a production, like a larger corporate environment type of infrastructure, or even like a, a semi-sophisticated startup, and they get much more sophisticated. But a lot of this infra isn't even needed, right? Like some of you are out there probably like, I just run cron jobs. Like I do a lot of my cron jobs too on different servers, right? Sometimes you don't need this much, but it's always fun to stand up. So anyways, guys, I hope you had a great time. Don't forget at the end of this video, run a make down, right? Tear down all your resources. Don't get charged for it. I'll talk with you guys soon in the next video. Thanks. Have a good one. Bye-bye.